We all want the freedom to say what we want, but we'd really like to shut that guy off, or that woman off.
Right.
And so it's this thing we found out really powerfully with religion is everyone wants to have their religious freedom. Or not everyone, but the high percent want to live in a country where they have religious freedom. But they don't necessarily want religious freedom for everybody. And so, and that makes it very easy for the state to pass laws against minority religions or against selected religions then. Because the one thing you always have in a democracy is open and free elections is very powerful because it gives a majority a powerful rule. But if you don't balance that with some sort of independent judiciary, then you have what de Tocqueville said in the 19th century is a tyranny of the majority. So when you had the Arab Spring occurred, everybody thought, oh, great, democracy's hit, they'll be saved, all will be well. You find out that then you have this tyranny of the majority who then oppress everybody else. And that same thing would occur in any country unless you have some sort of balancing act to the majority voting principles there. So.
That was Roger Finke, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Sociology and International Affairs at Penn State University. Roger is also the founder of the Association of Religion Data Archives, which is an online archive of the best religion data available. He's the author of several books, but the one that caught my eye was his 2011 book with Brian Grimm, The Price of Freedom Denied: Religious Persecution and Conflict in the 21st Century. In this book, Grimm and Finke found that as religious freedoms are denied in a society, both by government and by social groups within that society, religious persecution increases. Given the quasi-establishments of evangelical Christianity developing throughout the land, it's important to be aware of the potential consequences of these church-state alliances. And today, Dr. Finke is going to help us understand that better. Welcome to the podcast series, Telling Jefferson Lies. I'm Warren Throckmorton. This season, I'm focusing on two main aspects of the false belief that America was founded as a Christian nation. First, I'm exposing the false history which props up Christian nation storytelling. Second, I am listening to experts discuss the weaknesses of Christian nationalism. This interview is part of that second purpose. This week's episode is with sociologist Roger Finke. Dr. Finke has researched the role of religious freedom in societies around the world. In his book with Brian Grimm, Finke reported that religious freedom was associated with numerous benefits to a society. I started the interview by asking Roger if he believed his research and results held up today. I used some of your research in the podcast last year to give some empirical evidence for the benefits of separation of church and state, religious freedom. Just first of all, do you still feel that way? So where are things now with those general ideas that you laid forward in that book?
Yeah, in the United States or globally?
Let's start with the United States.
As you know, one of the things we first looked at, or I first looked at my own research, was in the United States. And one of the things I was most interested in was how religious freedom was first established in the United States. And in part, it was an effort as far as to separate religion from the state, but it was also an effort to separate the state from religion, because neither one wanted the other one in their arena. And so it was to allow people to have the freedom to worship the way they wanted without state control, but it was also for the allowed the state to make decisions without religion controlling it. So from that, it really formed a freedom that allowed all religions to compete. And so whereas in colonial times, you're dominated by the Anglican Church or Episcopalians, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians, by 1850, they were small numbers and the Methodist and the Baptist is dominated. So that freedom, we saw the power of it as far as how much difference it could make in terms of which religions competed. But what later research where I really became interested in was how does that freedom also have an impact not only on the religions, but on the larger culture? So one of the things in the United States that's always been a mystery to some people is how can you have all these religions, but they're not at each other's throats? That they're not trying to in constant, like say in some countries where there's open conflict. Well, one of the things that the basic argument is if your religious freedoms are my religious freedoms, then I can't take yours away without taking away mine. And so that's kind of what it came out with many of these religion groups in the United States, and how at first, with especially Islam, when religious freedom was practiced more fully in the United States, how we had far less conflict than they did in Europe, as far as with some of these variety of different religious minorities. So that was what began in the United States, why we were interested in it. When you move to the international arena, then we started collecting data. When I was director of the Association of Religion Data Archives, we started collecting data on every country or almost virtually every country in the globe on what were the restrictions they placed on religion and what was the overall level of religious conflict and religious persecution in those countries. And at that time, the main arguments were saying conflict primarily occurs where you have a plurality of religions. And if you have a plurality of religions, you have to increase the overall levels of regulation to control those religions, or else you're going to have more conflict. What we found was really just the opposite, is, or at least a revision of the story at the least, is that where plurality occurs, the conflict occurs, it depends on what the reaction is to that pluralism of religions. So if you have a variety of religions, but the reaction is to favor one over another, subsidize one over another, or in some ways to regulate some but not regulate others, or to regulate them all, that is much when it's much more likely for persecution to occur. Because what happens in those cases is one is that the state is more open to persecuting religions because they have more authority to do so, because they can deny freedoms, and as a result, they can go beyond that. A second one is if there are favored religions. India is a good example of that today, where there's not formal state control of it, but there's favored religion in the word Hindu. And so you have a lot of social movements that are out there causing a lot of conflict because they're overlooking some of the reaction of those social movements against, especially Pentecostal Christians and Muslims are the two most targeted groups. Certainly Catholics, other groups get targeted, but those are the two most targeted groups. So, so yeah, it's not so much as far as whether there's just pluralism, but it's that response to the pluralism. And is everyone allowed to compete equally? And is everyone allowed to get full freedoms? And I should add one thing too. I keep talking about competition between religions or multiple religions, but the other one is also in more recent stuff since I published that book is real emphasis on secularism as an alternative religion. Because you see in many states now that there's a real competition between religious freedoms versus what would be considered the religion of secularism, that you have no expression of religion in the public arena. You have no public expression of religion as far as in many of these institutions. So you can have, and then if you go to extreme examples of secularism, then you have like say China and others that want to regulate it for different reasons. But even when you take many European countries, that ideology of secularism can be a real force for regulating religion as well too. So anyway, that might be longer than you want there, but that's how I got into it.
I got a couple things I want to follow up there, and then I want to come to today's situation. You mentioned India. There's a state in India, I think, that's more predominantly Christian. Outside of that state, isn't there a lot of, and I believe you mentioned this, where Christian businesses might be targeted, maybe vandalized, and the police don't do anything. And that's going on today. And that's the rise of Hindu nationalism.
Yeah. I think India has gone much further down this alliance as far as of social movements that are trying to control religions within the country, as opposed to the United States, because it become much more violent, and the police turn a blind eye to much of the violence occurring in India. So they go in and they will disturb a religious service, or if someone is on a corner proselytizing, they will openly persecute and produce physical harm on them. So Sometimes the police are overlooking these social movements, this nationalism with Hindu nationalism, but it's much more violent than what is the United States. Now, in the Christian nationalism in the U.S., there a couple of things are a little bit different. There's, one, much of what's occurring in the U.S. is called Christian nationalism, and certainly it has alliances with certain churches. But at the same time, some of the people who are most devout in their walk with their religious life are not the ones who are the strongest believers in Christian
Right.
nationalism. And so while you do have a core of people who want to go back to the way things were, and their view of the way things were was that we were always a Christian nation, and that certainly is there. So I think it's different than India, or certainly not at the same level, the same extent as India, but yeah, there's certainly still some of the same concerns where and one other thing on nationalism I'd say is sometimes with nationalism there's this plea for sometimes not so much going back to Christian nationalism as getting away from Arab or Muslim nationalism. So, for example, in Germany, their most conservative party, a grad student of mine did some research on them, the AfD, and they found out that they actually have more atheists in their nationalism party than they do in their Marxist party, which we typically think of the Marxist party as being more atheistic oriented. So in that case, sometimes they will make vague pleas to wanting to remain what they've always been in Germany, a Christian nation, but it's not because they're highly Christian themselves. So I think it's clearly all of these are forms of nationalism, wanting to go back to what we were, even though that didn't always exist. But it doesn't always involve as much religion as sometimes, I think in India it does. In the US, I think it's a mixture. And then in ones like Germany, there's almost no close religious affiliation at all.
Mm. Going back to what you found in your book,
Yeah.
do you still see that the basic theses, do they hold up today?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, because there are there are a variety of reasons as far as that states still want to regulate or restrict religious activity. I mean, I think they have a lot of motives for doing so. There's sometimes very different motives. Sometimes they have the motive for restricting religion because they have a favored religion they want to form an alliance with. Sometimes they have a motive for doing so because they view it as a security threat. Sometimes they have a motive for doing it because they want to get religion so it's not in competition with the state. Maybe there's religious political parties which are too powerful. And so there's a whole lot of motives as far as why the state doesn't want religion involved. But to the extent states then want to restrict the activities of religion, then that results in all sorts of other problems. Because once those restrictions go into place, then typically they will go into place more for some religions than others, where there's clear open discrimination against some religions. And quite often it will result in some persecution by the state on those religions and some social conflict from those because they have grievances as a result of having regulations placed on them. Now, many times these religions go along very quietly and they do nothing about it, but not always. It depends on what percent of them, of the population they are. It depends on a wide variety. But I think there's no question that the level of religious freedom has a great impact on the resulting level of discrimination and the level of religious persecution that occurs, and is related, but there's many other factors involved to overall social conflict between these groups as well too. So yeah, that part of it, I don't see it changing much. I just talked with a colleague of mine in Israel who's continuing to work in this area and has certainly not found anything that's changed dramatically since earlier collections.
Mm,
So,
okay.
and the one thing too, along this line too, Warren, is it continues to increase. I think Pew has continued to use the data collection procedures we developed at Penn State, at the ARDA, and they've continued to use them, and they found that they continue to rise. And then for the last couple of 2-3 years, it's kind of plateaued, but it's still at a very high level.
You had another measure that I just found fascinating, that it seemed like current events, and that was this gap between the amount of religious freedom people wanted for themselves and that they were willing to commit to others. Are there any current measures of that you're aware of?
No, I do not know of any current ones. I agree. I think that's one of the most powerful ones. And it's not distinctive to the human right of religious freedom. It's the same way with freedom of speech. We all want the freedom to say what we want, but we'd really like to shut that guy off,
Right.
or that woman
Right.
off. And so it's the thing we found out really powerfully with religion is everyone wants to have their religious freedom, or not everyone, but that high percent want to live in a country where they have religious freedom, but they don't necessarily want religious freedom for everybody. And and so yeah, and that makes it very easy for the state to pass laws against minority religions or against selected religions then. Because the one thing you always have in a democracy is open and free elections is very powerful because it gives a majority a powerful rule. But if you don't balance that with some sort of independent judiciary, then you have what de Tocqueville said in the 19th century is a tyranny of the majority. So when you had the Arab Spring occurred, everybody thought, oh, great, democracy's hit, they'll be saved, all will be well. You find out that then you have this tyranny of the majority who then oppress everybody else. And that same thing would occur in any country unless you have some sort of balancing act to the majority voting principles there. So
I would bet we got a higher gap in the U.S. today.
I think too, I think this gap, the thing that surprised me a little bit, sometimes the gap was the greatest in the countries where you have, where they most want to restrict religious freedoms, you know. And so those are the very countries where, yeah, I want to have my religious freedoms, but these other people who are causing us problems, we want to silence them, and we want some. And the thing, other thing to recall, you might have noticed is one of the very subtle ways that religions are often controlled is what they just something as benign as religious registration, and it seems really simple. You just require religions to register. But inevitably, they put all sorts of criteria on the registration process that discriminate against some religions but not others, or they make it so difficult for anyone to register. You have almost no religions that can legally register. So there's all sorts of very subtle ways that the government can impose burdens on these religions that then eventually make it very difficult for them to exist. And then if they exist, it makes it very open that people can openly persecute them without fear of the law. Because if you are an illegal or an unregistered group in Russia and you're the Jehovah Witnesses and you're witness or you're witnessing your worshiping in your facility, and someone suddenly shoots, comes by and puts bullet holes in the side of your building, you probably don't want to report it because you don't want to report that you were worshiping, even though you're being openly persecuted. And this is a very real example, but there's numerous examples like that. Whereas just that really subtle requirement of religious registry can make a very major impact on these religious groups.
Well, let's talk about the U.S. case. Is there any way that gap, as small as it was, now here, let me do an aside. I suspect that gap would increase depending upon which subgroup of Americans you asked. I have a feeling if you could get a sample of Christian nationalists, those who believe America should be a Christian nation, was founded as a Christian nation, there'd be a bigger gap there because many of them openly say, we think only Christians should be in office. We think only Christians should be in power. I mean, they say this, right out. Some of them even say that that's what the Constitution says. So there would probably be a bit bigger gap there. Do you see any way in the United States that the government does favor Christianity, preference Christianity over other minority religions? Not that blatantly to make them make minority religions register. I know we're not there yet, but anything more subtle that you might see?
I think that the more subtle ones occur both with social, the things that occur just in social communities, the types of celebrations that are held in social communities, the prayer and so forth. And then I think with local governments, it's much more likely to occur because in local governments, they will enact things that are distinctively Christian. So I think in those cases, those are areas where it clearly does occur. Yeah, I think in terms of the gap, though, between what people want and what they receive, I think that sometimes it would be those that are the majority that are more likely to want their freedoms, but not the freedoms of others. When I was in Dearborn, Michigan, I was talking to imams there. One of the imams said that when they went to rent space for a Islamic center in a local shopping mall, that they refused to rent it to them because they didn't want to have a group of Muslims in the shopping mall. And he said he was shocked that a group of Protestant ministers and Catholic priests came to their defense and says his freedoms are our freedoms. He should be allowed to rent this space. And so he was so impressed with that. But I think that type of mentality doesn't exist for a lot of people because they don't want them to have the same religious freedoms. So, yeah, but in terms of how you have everyone want to protect other person's freedoms, I really think the bottom line still comes down to when people are very clear that their freedoms rely on other people's freedoms, that's what really makes a difference. When they know that they will lose freedoms if they start taking the freedoms away from other people.
Now, I think your model that includes both government control and
Yeah.
social influence, I think that really allows the private individual, just a average citizen, to say, I can actually do something about this because your acceptance of all people's right to worship really
Right.
matters, right? Is that what the
Yeah.
model
Yeah.
suggests?
Yeah, and I think especially in the area of the social discrimination, I think like this group of ministers in Dearborn, they made a real effort to say, hey, we are not going to mobilize against this Islamic group. We might have very different religious views. We might even proselytize them, but they have every right to exist and they have the right to set up the Islamic Center here. So I think, yeah, those are areas where people can have a real impact, especially on societal discrimination. With government discrimination and the courts, that's often outside of our reach. But yeah, I think clearly with societal you can.
Now, let's say a government said, we're only going to celebrate. Now, they may not say this in specific words, but by their actions, they eliminate all holidays that are not tied to Christianity in some way for public employees to take or celebrate or get time off for. Would that be an action that would be akin to what you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, that one is yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I do know a lot of religious minorities who don't mind us still celebrating Christian holidays because they think, well, the majority of people are Christian. What's the big deal? If I live in Israel, I think we celebrate Jewish holidays. So, so in that regard, sometimes the celebration of holidays, I see less protest against that. But I think anything that shows a sensitivity to that other people get time off for their holidays, or that we're aware of other people's willing to express their religious freedom openly. And I think especially one of the things we often underestimate is most of the laws are set in place for individuals because with most human rights, it's all about individual rights, the rights of freedom to be, equal opportunity, for women, for minorities, for other groups like that. In the case of religion, all the laws are written for individuals, but religions have it's very important to know how their institutions are regulated because it's much easier to regulate religious institutions that are very highly public, they're visible. You can place demands on them that you couldn't place on an individual. So governments can say, we're not going to regulate your individual freedoms, but we are going to regulate your institutions. And I think that's where, in all of these countries, they have to be very careful not to, like, say, religious registration is one of them, that you place restrictions on the institution that then curtail or limit the religious rights of the individual.
Mhm.
And I think that's one that often threatens these groups, are those that type of discrimination.
Well, and I think that's what we're going to have to watch actually going forward with these executive orders. I don't know if you've seen the recent ones, some of the DEI things.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to see it myself or confirm it, but so I've read some reports about government agencies, not allowing certain celebrations, holidays that are associated with minorities and that kind of thing, and minority religion. Again, it's not so much the time off, I imagine, it's just that it seems targeted.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, it's in the same way, like say with some of these religious registration requirements, they would require a certain size or a certain number of years that religions had to be in the state. For example, in Russia, when they eliminated 980 religions in 1 year, it was because they required a minimum of 15 or 25 years they'd been in the state in the country. So there's a lot of very subtle ways to restrict these religions, both at the individual level and at the organizational level. And either one can be, especially with religion, either one can be very harmful because with religion, people rely on institutions to do rites of passage. They rely on religion for public worship and prayer. And so it's very much institutionally oriented. And so either type of discrimination can really have an impact.
Now, let's draw it around back to some of what I was talking about last year. If that's the case, and I certainly think you've made an incredible case in your work that religious freedom is hindered by social factors and government restriction, what does that predict for a whole host of outcomes that you identified in your book? There were, I can't recall the number. You've got economic freedom, lower poverty, lower levels of armed conflict,
Right.
all of these really desirable outcomes.
Right.
Can we predict that we might see a decline in some of these outcomes if the United
In
States?
some, yeah, in some we probably would, and in some we wouldn't. The surprising thing is, in some more recent research I was doing with Dane Maddock, we found that, like say, higher levels of education do not predict higher levels of religious freedom. And perhaps in part that is because higher levels of education are sometimes align with higher levels of sort of a secularism, if you will, approach to the importance of secularism. So some of them like that are don't seem to be as closely aligned. However, in other areas, yeah, there's a very close alignment where the when you think about it, the freedom to express yourself openly religiously is really the same as the freedom to express yourself openly, freedom of speech or any other way. So the two, it's hard to take away one and keep the other, and so it's going to definitely have an impact. The same way, the freedom to meet as a group, to have public assembly, and the freedom to worship in public are one is a part of another one. To take one away is going to harm, it's going to make more conditions for, yeah, there's other, you can do public assembly, but you can't do it religiously, you can't do it in this way. So I think, yeah, in a whole lot of those areas, you start taking away religious freedoms and you start harming some of these other rights as well. You start harming some of these other benefits as well. And when it comes even to economics, one of the reasons that in the early colonial times, that a lot of people who were simply pragmatic said, we want all these different, we'll even let Catholics in. That's how desperate they were. Catholics, even Jews. And so they were so desperate that I'm Catholic, by the way, but they were so desperate for this that they would even let these Catholics and Jews in. But the reason was, it was not because they liked Catholics or Jews. It was because they thought it was going to be good for them financially, economically. And so in the same way, right now, being more open to a variety of other religions does that same thing economically for some countries as well.
Man, that almost sounds like diversity. Uh,
Yeah.
well, it's a little dangerous. In your book, you talk about a bundled commodity of human freedoms. And that sounds, I mean, you were kind of implying that idea. I wonder if you could just riff on that just a little bit more, that you can't really just pull out religious freedom, that it's, and, Thomas Jefferson, sounds like you've studied him. I mean, he talked
Right.
about this too, that this is just a part of natural rights.
Right.
And when Christian nationalists and others start talking about government setting a Christian prince and setting up Christian authority and so forth, they're rejecting natural rights, it seems to me. Maybe talk a little bit more about the bundled commodity of human rights.
Right, right. Well, it's interesting too, is with Christian nationalism, it is true that they're sometimes trying to separate these things. But if you look at a lot of religious traditions, I mean, the most obvious one is Catholicism because they have a lot of publications on it. But there's a lot of other groups too that talk about the importance of these inalienable rights. And these rights do include, this freedom of expression, this freedom of belief. And so I think where some people view these freedoms as being unfriendly to religion, I think in reality, most of them came out of religion. If you look back historically with the early work, I mean, this came out of, there's neither Jew nor Greek, these come out of biblical sources. So, and obviously the Catholic Church, when they put up together documents, they document this history. So I don't think that they don't get along, but I think that clearly has been the way they've been presented politically in recent times with some Christian nationalism, that you could have one without the other. And I think that that's been I think it's been a big mistake for a number of reasons, maybe politically, but certainly a big mistake in terms of just with the theology of these religious groups. It's not the theology that actually represents their theology. And as I said before, even from a purely political standpoint, you can't have freedom of speech if you don't allow freedom of expression of religion. You can't have freedom of assembly if you can't allow people to assemble to worship. And so, again, trying to artificially separate these, discriminate against religion, not others, or discriminate against any group, but then not others, it you've removed that right. Then you've made it limited that right to only certain groups or certain areas.
And as you state in your work, that actually increases conflict.
It does.
The
It does.
You might hope that you tamp it down, but
Yeah.
history teaches us that it only increases it.
Yeah, and you take the Russia right now in their attempt to both support and control the Orthodox Church in Russia. Um, they gave a subsidy to the Orthodox Church, which means the Orthodox Church can't speak as freely because they have to you know to do homage to the state, but at the same time they can openly persecute against these minority religions throughout Russia, which results in more conflict between them and some of these minority groups. The most open conflict is perhaps as far as with Muslim groups, but within Russia, you have some very open persecution. Jehovah's Witnesses always get picked on. Pentecostals always get picked on. So you have all these groups that face a lot of persecution from the state, but they can also face open persecution from other social groups because the state will turn a blind eye to it.
You mentioned Russia, and then I'm thinking about registration. I'm
Uh,
trying to think about other relatively current United States illustrations of that. And I'm thinking about this case in Oklahoma where there's a parochial school that is seeking state tax dollars, charter school, I guess, Christian school. And the Oklahoma Supreme Court said no, but it's being appealed. I think the Supreme Court's going to hear it. Now, if they allow that, and let's say a Hindu school applies, they should get the money too, right?
yeah, they should. I mean,
But if they don't, then that would be the kind of favoritism that
absolutely,
is in line with, yeah,
absolutely. Now,
okay,
the other thing I'll say too, with in the U.S. example is a lot of the cases have been coming forward and that they are citing this as a conservative court in favor of religion. They've been more, the First Amendment has both an establishment clause, separation of church and state, and a
right,
religious freedom
right,
clause. And people have tended, especially the Christian nationalists, tend to be more concerned about the establishment clause. They sort of want to reestablish Christianity as the state religion.
right.
My far greater concern, I think the concern should be greater for them, is the religious freedom clause. To what extent
Mm-hmm.
are people allowed to still openly express themselves in public schools? Are they still openly allowed to assemble in parks and other areas like that, even though they are religious? So I think that's the area that's far more threatened than the establishment part, which it seems to be what most of these groups want to go after, is they want to be
Yeah.
reestablished.
I'm also thinking about the Ten Commandments laws that are being passed, and it's like one form of the Ten Commandments, the Protestant form of the Ten Commandments, KJV, we're just excluding all others. And then the laws in Texas, or the bills in Texas, that would allow chaplains to substitute for school counselors. And I'm thinking, I mean, really, are there Hindu chaplains? Are there a lot, are there a lot of Druid chaplains? I mean, it's clearly favoring Christianity. It just seems to me to be a foot in the door. I don't know how you see that.
Anything that tries to set up an alliance between the religion and the state for only one religion is potentially harmful. I mean,
Yeah.
because it alienates the other religions and it also gives a certain amount of power to the single religion as far as against other religions. So I think any of that is potentially dangerous. It certainly has improved that way internationally, let me say that. And anything that on the other side of that, you have those who are trying to they want to separate church and state, but what they want to do is completely separate where religion cannot be a part of any public arena, where religion cannot be a part of public institutions, whether they be universities or whatever setting. And I think that is really much greater danger lies there for religious people, is that religious freedom component. To what extent is sort of this ideology of secularism going to exclude them from a lot of arenas? And there, they need to protect the rights of Muslims, of Jews, of Hindus, just as they need to protect their own right, because they have to form an alliance. As you know, even in the early colonies, you had alliances being formed that they weren't friendly. Normally weren't friendly, but they viewed that this is just pragmatic. In order to get this done, we have to do
Right.
it this way.
Right.
In the same way, I think religions need to come together, and they are in some countries where they're aligning together simply because they view it as a threat against their ability to practice religion openly.
Currently, I don't see any problem with evangelical Christians being able to practice their religion openly. However, Roger's advice may be quite wise for those on the outside looking in on the quasi-establishment of evangelical Christianity, which exists now in many parts of the United States. Roger's reference to the colonial period is on point. Many dissenting denominations of Christianity, such as the Baptists and Presbyterians and Quakers, didn't like each other very much, but at times they found common cause in their status as dissenters. Eventually, their influence helped win religious freedom for all. Let me give one current example of a quasi-establishment. For the past several years, Texas and Oklahoma seem to be in a competition to see which state can craft a quasi-establishment of evangelical Christianity in public schools. Oklahoma's Superintendent of Instruction, Ryan Walters, is currently fighting the courts to include Bible instruction in schools. And in Texas, the state recently passed a law to include the Protestant version of the Ten Commandments in every Texas classroom. Even more recently, curriculum has been approved, which includes Bible indoctrination for public school students in Texas, according to a report by Rice University's David Brockman. In a recent column, the president of People for the American Way, Savante Myrick, pushed back against this Christian favoritism. In the column, Myrick quoted American Federation of Teachers President Randy Weingarten and Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum. In a recent Houston Chronicle op-ed, Weingartner and Kleinbaum said, quote, "Embedding one form of Christian orthodoxy into schooling betrays the promise and purpose of public education to serve all students, including Christian students who don't believe that version of Christianity." End quote. I agree with that. In my religion, an honest depiction of history is what should be taught, and school is not church. I don't want teachers to take on the job of religious instruction. The same evangelical parents who are pushing for their views to be taught in school would not want other religions taught in the same schools. When put that way, most people want religious instruction kept at home and at church. I want to thank Roger for his time and expertise today. I think it's critical to remember Roger's if-then statement. Quote, "If your religious freedoms are my religious freedoms, then I can't take yours away without taking away mine." End quote. Christian nationalism attempts to make this one-sided. Christian nationalists want freedom and dominance for themselves, but not for those outside their group. As I understand Roger Finke's research, that kind of one-sided attitude and approach is what increases the risk of persecution and reduces freedom in a society. As in past segments, I end with a plea for us to live by the golden rule. Ideally, there should be no gap in the freedom I want for myself and that which I'm willing to give to others. Ultimately, in my view, separation of church and state is beneficial for religion and government and everybody who depends on both. Again, thanks to Roger Finke for his time and expertise today. Please follow the podcast and share it with your friends. I will be taking the month of August off to finish up details on the Christian past that wasn't. Watch for more information about additional episodes and the conclusion of the podcast in September. Music today was provided by Earl's Taco Shack and Jonas Fair. Thanks for all the great reviews and ratings, and as always, thanks for listening.